Have you ever wondered why some feelings seem too heavy to face, why you'd rather scroll, work, or joke your way out of them? Maybe it's anger that feels dangerous, sadness that feels pathetic, or loneliness that feels unbearable. We learn early on that certain emotions are bad, so we push them down, lock them away, and call it strength. But the truth is, what we avoid doesn't disappear. It waits, it festers, and it quietly shapes every decision, relationship, and pattern in our lives. Today, we're exploring the hidden cost of avoiding your emotions, the psychological toll that silence takes on the human psyche, and why real healing only begins when you finally allow yourself to feel. Psychologists call this emotional suppression, and it's one of the most common defense mechanisms in the modern world. We suppress feelings not because we're weak, but because at some point it was safer to do so. As children, maybe we cried and were told to toughen up. Maybe our anger led to punishment, or our sadness made someone uncomfortable. So we learned to disconnect, to survive by feeling less. This is what psychoanalyst Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress because they threaten our self-image. Yet the shadow doesn't vanish when ignored. It leaks out through sarcasm, numbness, anxiety, and self-sabotage. Avoidance feels like control, but it's actually a prison. When you suppress one emotion, you suppress them all. You can't selectively numb sadness without dulling joy, or silence anger without muting passion. Neuroscientific research by Daniel Wegner on thought suppression shows that trying not to think or feel something often makes it rebound stronger. The same is true with emotions. Avoidance amplifies what it tries to erase. Over time, this leads to chronic stress, fatigue, and a sense of emptiness that no amount of success or distraction can fill. Think of emotions as data, not danger. Each one carries information. Anger reveals boundaries crossed. Sadness signals loss or longing. Fear warns of risk or uncertainty. When we avoid these messages, we disconnect from reality itself. We live in emotional fog, reacting instead of responding. Psychologist Susan David, in her work on emotional agility, argues that avoidance is the opposite of resilience. True strength comes from making space for discomfort, not running from it. Because emotions aren't obstacles to growth, they are the raw material of growth. But emotional avoidance doesn't just harm the mind, it reshapes the body. Chronic suppression activates the sympathetic nervous system, keeping us in a low-grade fight or flight state. Cortisol stays high, digestion slows, sleep worsens, and tension builds in the muscles and chest. Over years, this constant physiological arousal can contribute to hypertension, anxiety, and even autoimmune issues. The body remembers what the mind refuses to feel. As trauma expert Bessel Kolk wrote in The Body Keeps the Score, emotions that cannot find their way to expression will often find their way into the body. Emotionally avoidant people often live in patterns of control, overworking, overthinking, overpleasing. They become masters of logic and planning, but strangers to their own hearts. Relationships suffer because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires emotional presence. Without that, we can only connect superficially. Partners feel unseen, friends feel distant, and we feel perpetually misunderstood. The paradox is cruel. In trying to avoid pain, we create isolation, and the loneliness that follows becomes even harder to face than the original feeling we ran from. So why do we cling to avoidance, even when it hurts us? Because feeling is terrifying when you've built an identity around not feeling. Many people unconsciously equate emotions with weakness, but that's a cultural illusion, a product of stoic conditioning and performance culture. In truth, emotional awareness is a sign of integration. It's the difference between reacting like a child and responding like an adult. Jung described individuation, the process of becoming whole, as the reconciliation of opposites within the self. To become whole, we must meet the parts we've disowned, including the ones that cry, rage, and tremble. Avoidance also thrives on distraction. In our digital age, we have endless tools to escape discomfort. Notifications, endless scrolling, caffeine, productivity, even self-improvement. We turn healing into performance, constantly optimizing instead of feeling. But emotions can't be fixed, they have to be witnessed. When you feel sadness, your task isn't to outsmart it, it's to sit beside it long enough to understand its story. What unmet need is it pointing to? What version of you is still waiting to be heard? The first step to breaking the avoidance cycle is awareness. Notice your impulse to distract. When discomfort arises, do you reach for your phone, food, or another task? The moment you can observe the avoidance, you've already created distance between you and the pattern. The second step is naming what you feel. Language brings order to chaos. Saying, I'm anxious or I feel grief activates the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate emotion. This process, known as affect labeling, is supported by research from Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, showing that naming emotions reduces amygdala activity and calms the nervous system. The third step is compassionate witnessing. Allow the emotion to exist without judging it. Instead of asking, how do I stop feeling this? Ask, what is this trying to show me? This shift turns suffering into insight. Over time, you realize emotions are temporary waves, not permanent storms. The goal isn't to drown in them, but to surf them, to feel fully, then let go. That's what mindfulness-based therapies teach. Equanimity, the balance between awareness and non-resistance. Yet, healing isn't linear. When we start to feel again, old wounds resurface. You might cry unexpectedly or feel anger you thought was gone. That's not regression, that's release. Emotions return to be integrated, not repressed again. Every feeling you face is a fragment of your psyche returning home. The process can be messy, but that's how authenticity is built, through confrontation, not avoidance. In relationships, emotional honesty transforms connection. When you express sadness instead of masking it with detachment, people see the real you. Vulnerability invites safety. It tells others, it's okay to be human here. That's how intimacy deepens. Avoidance protects the ego. Expression nourishes the soul. Over time, the walls you built to stay safe become the barriers keeping you lonely. When you choose to feel, those walls crumble, not into chaos, but into freedom. The cost of avoiding your emotions isn't just emotional, it's existential. You lose your aliveness. You start living on autopilot, chasing control instead of meaning. But life's beauty exists in the full spectrum of feeling. Joy without grief is hollow. Peace without pain is numbness. To feel deeply is to live deeply. That's the paradox. The emotions we fear the most are the very ones that reconnect us to ourselves. So if you've been running from your emotions, maybe the real act of courage isn't holding it together, but allowing yourself to fall apart. Not forever, but long enough to rebuild from truth instead of avoidance. Because underneath every feeling you've buried is a message waiting to be heard, and a self waiting to be reclaimed. In the end, emotional avoidance is not a character flaw, it's a learned survival strategy. But survival is not the same as living. The moment you choose to stop running, you begin to heal. The storm doesn't break you, it cleanses you. And in that quiet after the rain, you realize the truth. What you feared feeling was never your enemy. It was your path home.